It's so fun to bless our children and see their excitement about the new year and to begin a new church year. So I'm glad to be together, and like usual, I changed my sermon topic during the week. It's just been such a crazy week. Since the protests and the violence in Charlottesville, I just couldn't go with the message that I had with all the things that are happening. I mean, seeing so many Nazis in the streets of America with guns and helmets and army gear in 2017 was stunning to me. But I have to admit that men running through the streets with weapons yelling racist and anti-Semitic things is so reprehensible and so disturbing that I didn't initially think it required a lot of moral explication. I mean, who in their right minds would think that's okay? Yet over the last week, the public conversation about what happened in Charlottesville has been much more morally murky and divisive than I ever would have imagined. Now, our president's response to it all helped to open that door to a great deal of moral confusion. We're hearing that on both sides of the aisle. That's not a political or a partisan statement. The fact that there was violence on the side of the counter-protesters last Saturday also helped to create a situation in which the moral critique of the events requires a kind of sophistication regarding the role of violence and the parameters of protest that we're not really getting from a lot of what's on social media and in the newspapers and televisions. What I've not heard enough of is a clear and unequivocal condemnation of the neo-Nazis and white supremacists that also offers a thoughtful explication of how the violence on the part of the counter-protesters plays into the hands of these fascist groups and their agenda. They came looking for a fight last Saturday, and they got one. That was a victory for them. So that's what I want to talk about. That's what I decided I was going to talk about this morning. Because equating these two sides is obscene and is reckless. And yet, failing to recognize the dangers of a violent response to these groups has the potential to aid the hate groups in their efforts to divide our nation and to muddle the moral assessment of what they're doing. Nonviolent protest requires a level of commitment and discipline and self-sacrifice that I'm not sure all of the people who are prepared to head into these counter-protests that are happening across the country against these hate groups are prepared for or really understand. Now, the reason that I'm sharing this message this morning and feel there's a sense of immediacy and urgency about it is that I'm concerned that our youth and some of my colleagues and many people who I love might run into a conflict with neo-Nazis and other neo-fascists without being philosophically and practically prepared for what that means. Everybody I know is appalled by these groups and their hateful speech and their symbols and what they represent. Many of us grew up on the stories, those who weren't around in the 1960s, grew up on the stories and movies about Martin Luther King Jr. and the Civil Rights Movement. So we feel ready and motivated to do our part, to run onto the front lines in this new wave of the Civil Rights Movement. I love that impulse, but I'm realizing why Martin Luther King Jr. and the Southern Christian Leadership Council and the Highlander Center and all those people who were organizing and teaching nonviolence were so critical to the success of that movement. And successfully countering the hateful ideology that we're seeing in the streets and online across our country today is incredibly important that we do it and that we do it well. Remember that the leadership for ending racism in the 1960s did not initially come from the White House. It came from religious leaders, and it filtered up to the White House. And not just religious leaders, but religious people and congregations and communities. Now, for me, being a person of Jewish heritage, my father is Jewish, that whole side of my family are Jews, and being the father of an African-American daughter, watching the events in Charlottesville, I realized that this was not someone else's fight. That my family was being attacked and being told that we do not belong in this country by people who are organized and motivated and highly armed. For the past 20 years, since I became a minister, I've been outspoken and an activist on issues of discrimination and prejudice. And being straight and being white and being male and able-bodied and cisgendered and formally educated and employed and a U.S. citizen, I've done most of this advocacy as an ally. I'm very aware of the immense privilege that I'm afforded due to my social location and a lot of things that I did nothing to earn. And I've also felt that it's important for me, for my own liberation and my own wholeness, to be using the influence that I have to work for the liberation and equality of all people. Our liberation is truly bound up in one another. When my wife and I adopted our daughter 8 years ago, the birth mother who chose us was African American. So suddenly, my work around racial issues and racial justice became much more personal for me. As this church has grown increasingly diverse, the efforts that I'm a part of for social justice have become more personal because this congregation is like a family, and so attacks on the gay, lesbian, bisexual, and transgender community are attacks on my loved ones, and attacks on African Americans, and atheists, and immigrants, all become attacks on my people. But I've had to acknowledge that seeing the videos of large flags with swastikas and hearing anti-Semitic threats and threats to Jews such as Jews will not replace us and Jews are Satan and the Jewish media is going down and slurs like kike and other words that I've heard many times throughout my life against Jews hit me a lot more personally this week and this time. Now, there's the often quoted words of Reverend Martin Niemöller, a German Protestant minister during World War II. First, they came for the socialists, but I did not speak out because I was not a socialist. And then they came for the trade unionists, and I was not a trade unionist, so I did not speak out. And then they came for the Jews, and I wasn't a Jew, so I didn't speak out. And then they came for me, and there was no one left to speak out. And they did come for him. And he ended up in Dachau. But in my case, I did speak up. I've been speaking up. And still, there are folks coming for me and my family. And yet, even the President of the United States is not speaking out in a way that made me feel protected by him. It's chilling because his equivocation has fueled the hate groups And I'm not making that up, and the media is not creating that. They're saying that. If you're reading what they're writing and saying, they themselves are saying that his words and his approach has fueled them and made them feel affirmed and supported. And the ones protesting, they're not old German guys. They're 20-year-old young Americans, a new generation who look a lot like me and who share many of the same qualities and privileges that I have. Now, I've said it before that I am passionate about nonviolence, but I'm not a pacifist. I've been in many fights in my life when I was younger, and I would fight somebody again if they were to attack my family or try to harm someone in my presence. I'm not against self-defense when needed, but if I'm going to be attending a nonviolent protest, it means that I am committing myself to nonviolence and the consequences of it. For what I've seen and heard and read online, many of these neo-Nazis and others who were being protested last weekend, they would gladly harm and kill me and any one of us who gets in the way of what they're trying to do. So I'm not likely to go put my body on the line in front of them unless I'm ready to be severely injured or die in the cause. And I'll tell you one thing for sure. Trying to block those young men last weekend from legally entering a park or marching to a statue is not a cause I'm willing to die for. They can rally with torches. They can stand on monuments and scream at the top of their lungs and say all kinds of hateful things. But trying to stop them from doing this is not something that I would give my life for. In fact, I would be more likely to give my life to protect the rights of all people, even them, to assemble on behalf of their values, twisted and hateful as they are. To counter them, which I'm doing with this message and other things that I've written online, and which I plan to do in the streets of this city if they come, I would protest across the street from them. I would go and stand in solidarity with others in a place apart from them to show how many of us oppose their hatred and everything they represent. I would sweep the streets, symbolically sweeping away all the hatred that they bring to our city after they leave. I've done that now twice at City Hall against the Ku Klux Klan in my 17 years here, and once against a group that was anti-Muslim. I would speak at a counter rally the same day in a neighboring location. But I would not be willing to die to keep these people from speaking and assembling. Think about what I preach about religion. I say that Jesus is not the one and only way. I say that Muhammad is not the last and final prophet of God. I say that there's wisdom and goodness to be found in all of the world's religions. I claim that science and evolution are valid and important perspectives. That women have the right to make decisions about their own bodies regarding ending a pregnancy. Now, there are many people in Oklahoma and all around the world whose theology and church tells them that what I preach is heresy. And it's leading people to eternal torment. And what I preach about reproductive justice, they believe is murder. What if these people decided that they were going to put their bodies in front of me so that I could not preach or could not meet or we could not have these worship services. From their view, what I'm saying is even worse than murder, because murder only ends somebody's finite material life, whereas heresy destroys their eternal life and leads them into eternal suffering. What if these folks felt that my religion and perspective was so dangerous and so heinous and destructive that they would do anything to stop me and to stop us from sharing these ideas and spreading them and assembling? Where does it end? If we begin to keep people from peacefully assembling because we disagree with them, or we think their ideas are dangerous. Now, if the people last weekend in Charlottesville or across this great land were going to be doing physical harm to people, and the authorities were not willing or able to resist them, or were colluding with them, then I would have to decide. Would I fight their violence with violence, or would I try to use nonviolent resistance? It would be a strategic decision about what is the best way to stop these people from changing our society for the worse. Now, I'm philosophically inclined to nonviolent resistance wherever possible, because I believe it's usually more effective and it's always morally defensible. My point is, please do not go out and plan to nonviolently try to counter-protest and stop these people unless you are spiritually and physically prepared to deal with the consequences of nonviolent action. You might be severely hurt or killed. Make sure that the cause and the strategy for which you are protesting is worth it, and that the stand that you are taking will be effective in some way if it concludes with the ending of your life. This is serious business we're in right now. I want to make a really clear distinction. If someone comes directly at my children or my parents or my wife or myself in my daily life, I will stand my ground or run like heck to protect them and to protect myself. But if I submit to a nonviolent protest in which I'm placing my body in front of neo-Nazis and white supremacists and other neo-fascists in order to stop them from doing something that they have the legal right to do in this country, then I've chosen to resist at whatever cost. That's what the people in the civil rights movement did. That's what Gandhi and his followers did. They sometimes ran, but they never fought back. Last weekend, there were groups who came to oppose the white supremacists and the neo-Nazis who came ready and prepared to fight back. I can't support that kind of response to a political rally. I cannot support that kind of a response to a political rally, even if I find the political views atrocious, as I do in this case. Again, if these people were going to do some kind of violent rampage, destroying property and harming people, I would hope that the authorities could handle them. But if for some reason the authorities couldn't, then I might support violent resistance from the citizenry. It might be necessary. We're not saying it would never be necessary, but nobody wants to defeat these kind of ideologies and this kind of hatred in our country. this kind of animus and violence towards Jews and African Americans and others, gay and lesbian people, than I do. And I will continue to offer my voice, and I will continue to witness in nonviolent ways. I will protest them in ways that do not involve putting my body in front of them to stop them from speaking or to stop them from marching. Now, if I were to die in a peaceful protest for civil rights, for freedom and equality for all people, I will have lived my values and purpose in this world and in this life. When I went to Uganda in 2010 to join with the gay and lesbian community there, led by the Unitarian Universalist minister in Uganda, who was a close colleague of mine at the time, Mark Kiemba, as part of this protest that they were having against a bill that was outlawing gay and lesbian people, and even in some cases making it a capital offense, punishable by death, that I knew that I could be beaten, I knew that I could be arrested, and I knew that I could be killed. For many reasons that I outlined at the time from this pulpit, I felt compelled to go, and I was prepared to take whatever consequences might befall me. But I am not prepared to die to keep people from the freedom of speech or freedom of assembly in this country. Many young men fought and died. Ask Charlie over here, who fought in World War II. Ask Lou over here, who fought for our country. Many of our own young men have fought and died for the freedom to assemble and the freedom of speech in this country. It's an important part of our democracy. So I won't die to stop anyone from the freedom to speak. But I know that you will make your own decisions, and I know that we will not always agree. But I hope that you'll be safe. And I hope that you will join in nonviolent resistance of this current movement of neo-fascism and hatred that is spreading in our country right now. But I hope you'll do it in ways that are effective, in ways that are smart, ways that are nonviolent. Let us help to bring greater peace and justice for all in ways that are nonviolent, in ways that are smart, and in ways that make this a better world. Thank you.